In the closing months of World War II, Berlin was on the brink of collapse. The once formidable capital of the Nazi regime had endured years of relentless Allied bombing. But its final blow was the arrival of the Soviet Red Army. What followed was not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a nightmare for the women of Berlin. What exactly did the Soviet soldiers do to the German women? And why are these stories so crucial to understanding the human cost of war? Stick around as this episode dives deep into the shadows of history to uncover these lesser-known truths. Love history? Hit subscribe for more stories just like this. As the Soviet army advanced, they brought with them the trauma and fury from years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. They had seen their villages destroyed, their loved ones killed, and their country burned by Nazi forces. Fueled by Soviet propaganda that painted Germans as enemies who deserved revenge, the soldiers arrived with rage and retribution in their hearts. For them, this wasn't just a military conquest, it was personal payback. But how far would this need for revenge push them, and who would bear the brunt of their anger? Berlin's women were already living in a desperate state. The city's infrastructure had crumbled, food was scarce, clean water was a luxury, and basic utilities like electricity had become memories. Many of their husbands, fathers, and sons were either dead, missing, or so deeply scarred by war that they couldn't return. The responsibility of survival fell on the women. But when the Soviet soldiers arrived, survival took on an entirely new and horrifying meaning. How could these women, already pushed to the edge, navigate the looming threat that was about to descend on them? Take, for instance, the story of an ordinary German woman, much like Martha Hillers, who sought shelter when Soviet forces stormed into Berlin. Along with many others, she hid in a basement, hoping the soldiers would pass by without noticing. For days, the occupants survived on whatever meager food they had, their nerves fraying with each passing hour. But one night, the soldiers found them, dragged them from their refuge. She and other women became victims of repeated assaults, acts that would haunt them long after the war ended. Do you love history? Hit subscribe for more stories just like this. The Red Army's arrival was not just a signal of victory over the Nazis, it was a storm of violence. The women of Berlin faced assaults on an unimaginable scale. Estimates suggest that up to 2 million German women were sexually assaulted during the Soviet invasion, with around 100,000 incidents happening in Berlin alone. These are staggering numbers, but the real stories behind them are what truly captures the horror of those days. What exactly happened within the walls of Berlin's ruined buildings? The truth is even more chilling than you might expect. Women tried everything to avoid the soldiers. They hid in basements, attics, or the ruins of buildings, hoping the dark corners would provide safety. Some even disguised themselves, pretending to be elderly or sick, believing this would make them less of a target. Yet despite these efforts, they found themselves exposed and vulnerable. Can you imagine the fear, the knowledge that no matter where you hid or how well you disguised yourself, there was still a chance you'd be found? And what then? For the soldiers, this violence was justified. The Red Army soldiers were told they were liberating their land and avenging their loved ones. For many, this translated into a desire to take whatever they wanted, including the bodies of Berlin women. But how did these soldiers justify such brutality in their minds? And how did these women, who were already suffering, bear such an unimaginable burden? The assaults didn't just leave physical scars, the psychological impact was immense. These women had already witnessed the destruction of their city, and now they were faced with a new kind of terror. Many felt completely isolated, unable to communicate with the soldiers. They were left to navigate a world that had turned hostile overnight. And while some soldiers displayed rare moments of compassion, offering food or temporary shelter, these moments were rare exceptions. For most women, the reality was fear, violence, and uncertainty. Another less-known detail about the Soviet invasion is the strategy some women used to protect themselves. In certain neighborhoods, women banded together, forming informal networks to warn each other of approaching soldiers. They developed signals, whistles, coded knocks to alert each other when danger was near. Some would hide in groups, believing there was safety in numbers. Yet even these desperate tactics were not always enough to fend off the relentless assault. How effective could such methods be when the enemy was everywhere and survival was no guarantee? The trauma didn't end when the Red Army moved on. The aftermath for many women was just as devastating as the attacks themselves. Some became pregnant as a result of the assaults, and in a society that was already in ruins, these pregnancies were a heavy burden. Abortion was illegal and dangerous, but some felt they had no other option. Those who carried the pregnancies to term faced further humiliation and rejection. Children born from these assaults often grew up as social outcasts, reminders of a painful past that their mothers could never escape. How do you move forward when every day is a reminder of what happened? Let's pause and delve into a hidden fact that isn't often discussed: the complicity of some German men in this tragedy. While many men had either been killed or sent off to war, some who remained in Berlin did little to protect the women. Overwhelmed by the situation and fearful of Soviet retaliation, these men sometimes turned a blind eye to the violence happening around them. In post-war memories, some women expressed feelings of betrayal, not only by the Soviet soldiers, but also by the men who had failed to protect them. How do you rebuild trust in a community when even those you relied on most couldn't shield you from harm? The silence surrounding these assaults was compounded by the shame and stigma associated with them. In post-war Germany, as the nation focused on rebuilding, little attention was given to the suffering of these women. Survivors often kept their stories to themselves, fearing judgment or being labeled as tainted. For decades, their trauma remained buried, hidden beneath the narrative of Germany's recovery. But how long can a nation ignore its wounds before they fester into something deeper and more painful? But why is this such a hidden chapter of World War II history? There's so much more to uncover. Hit subscribe and stay in the loop. Post-war Germany, divided between the East and the West, was under the influence of both Soviet and Allied forces. For the Soviets, admitting to the scale of the assaults would have damaged their image as liberators. On the other hand, West Germany, eager to distance itself from its Nazi past and align with Western powers, was hesitant to confront such a painful reality. Thus, the stories of these women became a casualty of the Cold War, a truth too inconvenient for either side to fully acknowledge. It wasn't until decades later, as survivors grew older and felt the need to share their stories, that these events began to come to light. Through memories, interviews, and documentaries, the experiences of these women slowly emerged. One such survivor, Gisela Urban, shared her story years later, detailing how she was assaulted at the age of 15. Her bravery in recounting her trauma has helped to shed light on the scale and brutality of what happened, ensuring that the voices of these women are not forgotten. But for every story that's told, how many remain silent, trapped in the shadows of history? Despite this progress, much work remains to be done. Historians and researchers continue to uncover stories, piecing together accounts to create a fuller picture of what truly occurred in 1945. It's a delicate process, as many records from the time are incomplete or intentionally erased. Yet each new testimony adds another layer to our understanding of the past, reminding us of the importance of preserving these stories. How many more voices are waiting to be heard, and what truths will they reveal? The impact of these assaults didn't just end with the war, they rippled through generations. The children born as a result of these incidents often struggled with identity, feeling caught between two worlds. Some faced bullying, others were ostracized, and many were haunted by the knowledge of their origins. These stories reveal that the legacy of war is far more than just battles and treaties. It's a series of scars that linger long after the final shots are fired. To truly understand the human cost of World War II, we must look beyond the battlefield. The experiences of the German women during the Soviet invasion remind us that war's most profound damage often happens away from the front lines. It's the civilians, the women, and the children who bear the brunt of the conflict, their lives forever altered by forces beyond their control. By shedding light on these stories, we honor the victims and ensure that their suffering is not lost to history. Enjoyed today's journey through history? Subscribe and come along for more adventures.